So now what we want to do is go ahead and set up our second reducer, where we're going to use some of the actions that we just created in our toppings action file. And we're going to then use them in a toppings reducer. So if you jump into your reducers folder, what we want to create is the toppings.reducer.ts. The first thing that we can do is import all of our actions. So we're going to say from toppings, and we get that from back in our actions folder, and then inside that toppings.action. Secondly, we need the interface, which we're going to use. So we're going to import the topping interface, and we get that from back a few directories inside the models folder, inside the topping.model. So we should have these. This is pretty much all we need to actually import. So underneath, we need to first define our interface for the topping state. If we check out in the pizzas, if we scroll up the top, we have a few things. We have that interface, then we have the initial state, and then we have the reducer. So we need to do a similar thing here. So let's start off by export the interface. Now we're going to call this one the toppings state. What we want on the toppings state, we are also getting given back those toppings via an array, as we previously mentioned. However, we're going to map these across to entities. So we're going to need to keep those as entities. This keeps the data structure the same when we come to dealing with the pizzas and the toppings. Now, again, we're going to say each topping is going to be stored by its ID, which will then be of type number. Now, the value for this will be, in fact, the topping itself. Similarly to our other file, we also want that loaded boolean, and we also want the loading. So we need these two, and we want to keep track of whether something has been loaded or loading. So once we've got those, we can actually move on to exporting a constant, and we're going to call this one the initial state, which will be of type toppings state. And we're just simply going to say that that equals a brand new object, and we can create that entity's definition of an empty object. We can say loaded. By default, it's going to be false. Loading by default will also be false. So we should end up with something like this, which means that we can use these in our reducer, and then registering this reducer is actually going to be really simple. So we'll move down and we can start to create this reducer. So we'll export the function called the reducer. You may find that you want to call it something like the toppings reducer, but how we're actually importing these doesn't really matter too much. So in our index file, we're just referencing from pizzas.reducer. So momentarily we'll have toppings and we'll have from toppings.reducer. And we're accessing everything via that one import where we import everything. So let's continue and we can start building out this reducer. Now, as we know, it has the state, which we can then say is the value of the initial state. The next step, we can say the action will have a type of from toppings, and you can see that we have access to load toppings, fail, and the success, but we exported our custom type of toppings action. So that's what we're going to say is going to be the type for that. So you can see when we hover over this, we have a few options at our disposal, and TypeScript will keep these nice and in check for us. Now further down, our reducer returns something to do with the toppings state. Now inside the body of the function, we can then start to build out our reducer. So just like we need to remember, we always need to return state at the bottom, and then we can get started inside by actually building out the switch statements for our action types. So let's go ahead and we'll do switch action.type. Now inside of here is obviously where our cases live. So we're going to have case from toppings, and then we can access those load topping constants, the fail constants, and the success. So we'll keep things simple. We'll start off with the load toppings. Don't forget to put the colon here after the switch case. So this will allow us to then use these braces where we can put things inside, such as constants. So in fact, in the case of load toppings, we just want to return the state. So we can say return and then spread that state in. So this will copy across all the values once we've loaded those toppings. Now, just like in the pizza reducer, we also want to set this loading property to true, because when we dispatch load, we're then in a loading state until we have finalized things, and load topping success will then be fired and loading will be false and loaded will then be true. So let's do the next switch case. Let's go down and we can say case from toppings, and we're going to use the load toppings success. So inside of here, we can already kind of guess what's going to happen here. We want to access that payload, so we can say const give me all the toppings. That's going to be the action.payload, because we just set these up in our toppings actions. So when we get the success, we're going to have a toppings array. So we can start to think about modeling our data structures without actually having any data that's given to us immediately. So we can start to think, okay, now we need to map this across to an entity and we can return it. So then when we hook up an effect, everything will just slot into place and start working as we'd expect. So down here, I'm just going to set up the return blocks. What I like to do is actually set up the return blocks first and say, okay, I want to return the state, that's fine. And I want to set loaded now to true. And I also want to set loading to false. Now what we actually want to bind is in fact the entities. So we know by now we've got our boilerplate for this particular switch case set up. So it's time to actually compose those entities. Now what we can do for speed is just simply look at our existing entities function, where we can copy this and we're just going to return and paste it inside of here. Now instead of pizzas.reduced, it's going to be toppings.reduce, and instead of pizza, this will be topping. We can rename this one over to topping. We can rename this one to topping as well. And instead of the pizza ID and the pizza as the value, we can just simply say topping ID and then give it the value of the topping. So this will work as expected as it did before. Now, obviously you don't want to do and repeat the same code in every single reducer. So you could actually create a small function and import it from perhaps a utilities folder, and then you could pass the toppings as an array, and you could create a function, for example, called map to an entity or something similar, where it will return you this data structure that we're expecting. So now we've done this, we can actually grab the entity and we're going to just add this to our state object. So we can save that. Everything's nice. Everything's working as we would expect. So when we actually hook this up with the effect, everything will come through and work as we'd expect. So the next thing that we want to do, we have the return block. We want to create another switch case. So we're going to say case from toppings, and that's going to be the fail block. So inside of here, we're going to just toggle that state again. Nothing will be too complex inside of here. We just want to return, and we want to pass in that state. We want to set loaded is going to be false. Loading is then going to be false as well, because something has gone wrong. We're no longer loading, but we didn't successfully load. So this is why we're setting loaded back to false. So we can save that out. That's pretty much our reducer as it stands. Now we could go ahead at this point, and this is how I like to actually create my initial selector functions. And underneath here is where we can create things like get topping entities and get toppings loaded. So while we're here, and after you've kind of defined a reducer, it's good practice just to say export const get topping entities, and that will then be equal to state as a function. We get given that topping state, and we can simply return state.entities. I'll hide the sidebar so you can just see that a little bit more clearly. And then secondly, we can export const, and we're going to call this the get toppings loaded. That's going to equal a function which gives us a state which is of type topping state, and we're just going to simply return state.loaded. Now what we can do is just simply duplicate this one, change it over to loading, and we'll do the same here as well. So we can say get toppings loading. So we're pretty much done, and it's kind of nice to just export these. Even if we don't really use them, it's quite handy just to make sure that they're exported. It means that if you're working in a team or similar, or you potentially want to use these functions, it's nice just to export them at the bottom of the reducer, because this is where everything lives. It's nice and visible for us to obtain. So we'll open up the sidebar, and what we want to do now is quickly just jump into this index.ts inside the reducer. Now I mentioned we actually want to do from toppings instead of from pizzas. So we'll go ahead and just duplicate this line and then change this across to our toppings reducer. So at this point, we can then register that reducer on our product state interface. So what we're going to call this is the toppings. We obviously get this from the toppings, and we can use that toppings state to then define our new reducer. So now we actually have a red underline here, and that is because we do not actually use this toppings reducer. So to fix it, we need to actually register this. So we can say from toppings, and we can grab that reducer. So once you save that, our toppings is automatically going to be registered in our store module. And it's automatically registered because our reducer's constant, if we jump into our module, you can see here that we have the effects and the reducers, and that reducers object gets passed straight into our store module for feature with the products and the reducers for the products namespace. We can obviously click through and we end up back at the start where we just added that toppings reducer. So we're done in this video. We've set up the next reducer. What we're going to do in the next video is take a look at an effect, because we need to create a new effect to actually handle this load toppings request.